There was a substance abuse counselor who told a true story about one of his clients. There was a lady named Rebecca. And Rebecca needed to lose about 20 or 30 pounds. And she tried all the usual stuff. She tried all the fad diets, and that didn't work. She wasn't really disciplined enough to go on an exercise routine. So she began to think about how is it that I can lose this weight? And she became really desperate. And one day this thought popped into her mind. She thought, you know what? I've never seen a meth addict who's fat. So she said, I think what I'll do is I'll try just a little bit of meth. Just till I lose the weight that I need to, and then I'll just quit. Now you can imagine how that worked out for her. This is an actual true story. She did lose the 20 or 30 pounds, plus about another 50 on top of that. She also lost her teeth. I guess that counts as weight loss, right? She lost her job. She lost custody of her children. So I guess it worked a lot better than she thought in some ways. But it also robbed her of so many things. And that story just illustrates for us what happens when we get desperate, right? Desperation can cause us to do all kinds of things that we might not otherwise do. I mean, think about it. A businessman who's struggling, sometimes desperation will cause them to just forget all their morality, to forget their integrity in order to save their business. Maybe as a student, you guys are really desperate to pass a test, right? And that desperation might lead you to cheat on a test. How about some of you who maybe have been going through some difficult trials with physical ailments and disease? How many times do people who go through something like that, do they turn to some kind of alternative treatment hoping to get relief and find out that it's only worse than they were off in the first place? And really, if you think about it, desperation is what most advertisers try to create in us, right? They try to take some need or want that we have, and they try to just kind of multiply it up to the point where we become so desperate that we just got to have that product, even if it means that we're spending money that we don't really have. So desperation, it can cause us to do a lot of things that are harmful to us, right? I think we'd all agree. But it's not always like that. Used in the right way, desperation can also drive us to Jesus. And this morning we're going to look at a passage that shows us two people who that happened to them in their lives. They got so desperate that their desperation drove them to Jesus, which is obviously a good thing. Now, you're probably aware we're going through this study in the book of Matthew. So today we're going to be in Matthew chapter 9, beginning at verse 18. And I'll read the passage in just a moment. But before I do that, I want to just give you right up front the main idea that we're going to develop together this morning. Here it is. Desperate faith demands divine power. Would you read that out loud with me? Desperate faith demands divine power. Now, by the end of the message this morning, you're going to probably get tired of hearing me say that. But there's a method behind it. I want you to remember this. I think it's something very simple for us to remember, this idea that when we get desperate, that kind of desperate faith, it demands divine power. That's the only thing that's going to satisfy that desperation. And that's what this passage that we're going to look at this morning is all about. So if you have your Bibles, you can go ahead and open up to Matthew chapter 9. I'm going to begin reading this morning in verse 18. The verses will be up on the screen behind me as well if you don't have your Bibles with you. It says this, while he was saying these things to them, behold, a ruler came in and knelt before him, saying, my daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live. And Jesus rose and followed him with his disciples. And behold, a woman who had suffered from a discharge of blood for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment. For she said to herself, if I only touch his garment, I will be made well. Jesus turned, and seeing her, he said, take heart, daughter, your faith has made you well. And instantly the woman was made well. And when Jesus came to the ruler's house and saw the flute players and the crowd making a commotion, he said, go away, for the girl is not dead, but sleeping. and they laughed at him. But when the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took her by the hand, and the girl arose. And the report of this went throughout all that district. It's kind of a fascinating passage, isn't it? I mean, even the structure of the passage is kind of interesting. Because Matthew starts out here and he tells us about this ruler. And if you look at the accounts in Mark and Luke, you know that this ruler was a guy named Jairus. And he was the chief ruler of the synagogue there in Capernaum. So he would have been like the top dog there in that synagogue in Capernaum. He would have been someone who people respected. He would have been well known in that community. And he comes to Jesus. He says, Jesus, my daughter has just died. Will you come and heal her? And Jesus goes on his way to bring her back to life. But in the middle of this passage, Matthew inserts another account there, right? The account of this woman who has had a discharge of blood for 12 years. And then he goes back and he kind of finishes up the story of Jairus and his daughter. And it seems like at first glance, like these two accounts, these two stories, like they really don't have a lot in common. And yet when you look at them more closely, you find out there are actually a bunch of commonalities between the two accounts. The first one is the fact that that both of them are called daughters. This 12-year-old girl, we know she's 12 years old from the accounts in Mark and Luke. And notice I said women because in the Jewish culture, once you got to be 12 years old, you were considered to be a woman. So both these women are called daughters. There's Jairus' daughter, and then Jesus calls this other woman a daughter. The second thing that draws them together is this idea of 12 years. The girl is 12 years old. And the woman's had this discharge of blood for how long? 12 years, right? So there's that in common. They both had incurable diseases that could only be healed by Jesus. They were both healed by just a single touch. And then I think what's probably most relevant for us this morning is that they were both out of human options. They'd come to the end of their rope. They had nowhere else to go. There was nothing else they could do. And they had that desperate kind of faith. And as we've already seen, that kind of desperate faith, it demands divine power. And so this morning, what I want us to do is to kind of look at this idea. How do we incorporate that divine power into our lives? Now, what I'm not suggesting this morning is that you can only go to Jesus when you get that desperate. I mean, I think we all know that we need to go to Jesus whenever something comes up right away. He shouldn't be our last resort. He should be the very first place that we go. But I think if we're all honest, we're all a lot like Jairus and this woman, aren't we? We kind of try to fix everything ourselves. And it's only when we run out of options that we finally go and try to hang on to this divine power of Jesus. So this morning, I'm going to share with you three things that will help us to kind of incorporate and experience this divine power of Jesus into our lives. But I want you to understand that you don't have to be desperate before you put these things into place. They work just as well if you go to Jesus in the first place as well. So let's look together this morning at three ways that we can experience the divine power of Jesus in our lives. The first one is this, that I need to be humble. I need to be humble. As I mentioned earlier, Jairus was an important person. He was the ruler of the synagogue there in Capernaum, and he would have had all kinds of power. He would have had people that were trying to seek his attention and his favor. So he could have come to Jesus and he could have demanded that Jesus come help him, but he doesn't do that, does he? What does it say he does? He comes to Jesus and he does what? He kneels before him. And that word knelt, it's a really interesting verb. It's a verb that elsewhere in the New Testament sometimes is translated bow down. It's most commonly translated worship. So this guy comes before Jesus and he's going to humble himself and bow down. He's not going to demand that Jesus do something. He's going to be humble and actually worship Jesus. Some of you may be familiar with, there's a guy in Texas. He's a Texas state legislator, and he's running for the Senate there in the state of Texas. And this guy is well known for his brand of, quote, progressive Christianity. Now, that tells you something right off the bat. But here's something that he said just a few weeks ago that really caught my attention. He said this. He said, not once in the entire Bible does Jesus ask us to worship him. All he asks is that we follow him. Love like he loved, love the outcast, welcome the stranger. I think that tells you a lot about where this guy's probably coming from, right? Now, I suppose what he says at the beginning there might be technically correct. I don't know of any place in the New Testament where Jesus turns to someone and says, worship me. Literally says those words. But I got to tell you, when Jesus says, follow me, I think worship is wrapped up in there. He's not just saying, walk around behind me. He's saying, be like I am, worship me. Hold me up. And the dangerous part about what the guy says here to me is this. What he's implying there is that Jesus is somehow not worthy of worship, which means he's also implying that Jesus is not God. Because I think we'd all agree God is worthy of worship, right? So that's really dangerous, I think, what he's saying there. Now, while Jesus never says the words, worship me, at least as far as I can find, there are a number of places in the Bible, including this passage that we're looking at here today, where people do come up and they worship Jesus. And there's only two possibilities, because Jesus never once turns away that worship. He never says, oh, no, don't worship me. And there's only two possibilities here. Number one, he's a blasphemer because he's taking God's worship that doesn't belong to him. Or number two, he's God. Now, based on everything I know, I'm choosing number two. I'm choosing he's God in the flesh. And so here this ruler comes and he bows down before him and he worships him in great humility. And that's how we need to approach Jesus when we have this desperate faith that demands divine power. We need to come humbly before Jesus and bow down before him, not demanding that he does something in our life, but humbly coming before him. So that's the first thing. The second thing we need to do once we come humbly is we need to be bold. We need to be bold. Now, some of you right now, I know what you're thinking. Pat, didn't you just say be humble? And now you're saying be bold. Which is it? Yes. It's both. I think in our minds we tend to think that you can't be humble and be bold at the same time, but I'm going to prove to you here in just a few moments that being bold and being humble, they're not two separate things here. They're just different sides of the same coin. I'm reminded here of the passage in Hebrews, what the writer of Hebrews wrote in Hebrews chapter 14. He said this, let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Just another way to say that when we have desperate faith, we need that divine power and we come with confidence and boldness. I love the way the King James puts this same verse. It puts it this way. It says to come boldly unto the throne of grace. Boldly unto the throne of grace. And both Jairus and this woman, they come boldly before Jesus. If you go back to the account in Mark, you see that it says here that Jairus, that he implored Jesus earnestly. He implored him. He came boldly. He wasn't just like, well, Jesus, if you want to do something, go ahead. But no, he's like, his daughter's died. He comes boldly and asks Jesus to do something about it. Or how about the woman? She's had this going on for 12 years. And you can imagine, think about it, this wasn't just a physical problem for this woman. The fact that she had this discharge of blood, it was also a spiritual problem. It was also a social problem. She was considered to be unclean. She could not go into the synagogue and worship. And believe me, no one wanted to hang around this woman because they figured if somehow they accidentally touched her, they would become unclean as well. So she had all kinds of stuff going on. She had all kinds of reasons to not be bold to come before Jesus. I mean, think about it. In her mind, she's thinking about this and thinking, man, if I just touch Jesus, if I just touch the fringe on his garment, is that going to make him unclean? She had to be thinking about that. But we know that she thought this over in her mind. The verb saying there, when she was saying this, it means that she was basically saying this over and over and over to herself. She's mulling this over in her mind, and she's deciding, should I or shouldn't I? And finally she just decides, man, I'm going to go for it. She's bold. She reaches out, and as Jesus is walking by, she just touches the fringe of his garment, and she's healed. She was bold. Jairus was bold. But you know why they were bold? Just a moment ago, I shared with you a verse from Hebrews. It says to come boldly to the throne of grace. Let's look at the verse right before that, because that verse right before that tells us exactly why we can come boldly. It says this, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. You know why we can be bold when we are desperate? We can be bold going to Jesus, not because we deserve it, not because of anything we've done, but because what Jesus has already done for us. We can go boldly because he's the great high priest who has made it possible for us to have a relationship with God, to be able to come boldly to his throne. And so when we're desperate, we need to come with boldness. But the kind of boldness that's rooted in who Jesus is and what he's done for us, and not what we can do by ourselves. Because desperate faith demands divine power. There's one more thing that we need to do. I'm going to try to keep this really simple. Just 3 things this morning. We need to be expectant. We need to be expectant. You know, I think about Jairus and I think about this woman, and they both came to Jesus, and I don't think they knew exactly how this whole process was going to work out, right? They didn't come to Jesus and demand that he work in a certain way, but they trusted that Jesus would do whatever was right, whatever was good for them. They trusted that Jesus would do that. They were expecting him to work in these situations. Jairus expected that Jesus was going to do something. He didn't know exactly how, but he expected that Jesus would raise his daughter up. And we really see this with the woman here. I think she's a really great example of that. And I want to go back and look at just one verse again, in verse 22, because I think it really helps us to understand here what Jesus did here and how he worked far beyond what we could ever imagine. It says, Jesus turned, and seeing her, he said, "Take heart, daughter, your faith has made you well." That phrase, or that verb, "made you well," it's just one verb in the Greek. You know how that verb is usually translated? It has something to do with salvation or being saved. So what Jesus is saying to her here, not only has your faith made you physically well, but it's also cured you spiritually. And I think that's confirmed by the fact that he calls her daughter here. Daughter. That restored her dignity. It gave her a sense of worth. But most importantly of all, I'm pretty confident in saying that Jesus was welcoming her into his kingdom because of the fact that she had faith in him. So she came to be just healed physically. And what does Jesus do? He does what he always does. Something even better. He heals her spiritually at the same time. And how many times does Jesus do that in our lives? We go to him and we ask for something, and Jesus gives us something far more, far greater than what we would ever expect because he loves us. So desperate faith demands divine power. So The fact is that we don't have to be desperate to go to Jesus for his divine power, but there's a sense in which we all are desperate. You know what? When it comes to salvation, when it comes to our relationship with God, we bring nothing to the table. We're all filthy, dirty sinners who can't do anything for ourselves. So Jesus is still in the business of saving desperate people, and I would say to you that we're all desperate people. So the question is not, are you desperate? The question is, what are you going to do with your desperation? Are you going to take it to Jesus? Or are you going to try to figure it out on your own? So as we close this morning, I want you to consider how God might want you to respond to what we've learned together this morning. And I think there's really three possible things that God might be leading any or all of us to do this morning. First of all, there may be some of you here this morning who have never put your faith in Jesus Christ alone for the first time. You've never become so desperate for a relationship with God that you finally came to God and got on your knees and said, God, I can't do this on my own. I need Jesus. I put my faith in him. If that describes you, if you've never done that, I want to plead, I want to beg with you this morning. Don't leave here this morning until you make that decision. Maybe you don't understand exactly what that means or how to do it. I promise I'll be here after the service. There's nothing more that I would love than to talk to you about how you can put your faith in Jesus. If you're afraid to do that, my email address is in the bulletin. Email me. Get a hold of me during the week. I'd love to talk to you about that. So that might be something. Some of you might be at a place of desperation in your life right now, and you've been trying to handle things on your own. I don't know what that might be, but you've been trying to take it into your own hands, and you're at the end of your rope. And this morning, you need to take that and you need to give it over to Jesus. And you need to be humble and you need to be bold and you need to be expectant and give that over to Jesus. Third thing is this. Maybe this morning you can look back. And I think all of us could, if we're honest. We can look back on some situation in our life when we were desperate and Jesus poured in his divine power. And he did it in a way that amazed us. It was so much more than we deserved. And if you can think back to a time like that, just take some time to thank Jesus for that. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to give us all just a few minutes to consider those things, to go ahead and just bow your head, close your eyes, and just respond here however Jesus would lead you in these next few moments. Would you respond to him? Just want to encourage you this week to continue to allow God to speak to your heart. And Jonathan, don't go to the next slide yet. Don't look at your notes. How many of you can tell me what the main idea was this morning? Desperate faith demands what? Divine power. And that is true. And the good news for all of us is that God is still in the business of doing that, of pouring his divine power into our life. Not only is he able, but he's willing to do that. And when we take our desperation and turn it over to him, then we won't end up like Rebecca. We'll end up being closer to Jesus. So I want to encourage you to do that. As we close our time this morning, we're going to watch a short video to just remind us of the fact that we are all desperate for Jesus. And then we're going to close our time by singing, "It Is Well." I think that's a great